A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. In the course of his teaching, Jesus said to the crowds, "Beware of the scribes who like to go around in long robes and accept greetings in the marketplaces, seats of honor in the synagogues, and places of honor at banquets. They devour the houses of widows and as a pretext recite lengthy prayers. They will receive a very severe condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and observed how the crowd put money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow also came and put in 2 small coins worth a few cents. Calling his disciples to himself, he said to them, "Amen, I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all the other contributions to the treasury. For they have all contributed from their surplus wealth, but she, from her poverty, has contributed all she had, her whole livelihood." The Gospel of the Lord. If you went to the All Souls Day Mass here at Curé last Monday, please forgive me for telling the same story twice. But the purpose is, first, to build on that personal story. Second, to connect to this beautiful gospel that we just heard. And thirdly, to make a point about signs that we receive, both from the living and the dead. So about 6-7 weeks ago, before the end of September, I was at Holyrood Cemetery in Westbury. And for the first time since my mother passed away, two of my sisters were there. They weren't able to come up at the time of her passing. One of my brothers and a brother-in-law. And as we were at the gravesite, I decided to call my mother's caregiver, who was so beautifully attentive to her. So we all had a moment to speak with her, and then we were just chatting. I had the phone in my pocket, and all of a sudden, I feel the phone vibrating. And instead of pulling it out, I looked at my watch, and who was calling but M.O.M., my mother's landline from her house. Now, so I showed my sister that, and she said, look at this. And she said, "Well, answer it." So I pressed the green, and all of a sudden it just said, "Call failed." And so there was nobody else at the house. My brother, who lives there, was there. So we couldn't process it at the time, and later on that evening, my sister and I were out walking, and we were talking about it, and she said, "Well, maybe it was an accident, maybe it was let's say a butt call, So I pulled out the phone and checked calls received and calls sent, and there was a call that came in at 1:30, the call that went out to the caregiver at 1:38 in the afternoon, and there was another call about 35 minutes later as I was coming back. But no call in between, no call sent, no call received. So it's just a reminder, it is a reminder to me of how God speaks to us through our loved ones in so many different ways. Something like that happened again this week. I was looking for something in my sacristy drawer on Friday, and I discovered a bunch of dollar bills that I kept there. And I forgot that I put this little stash away in my drawer there for when my mother was alive, and when she would come to church here at Curé and sit where Loretta is sitting right now. So toward the end of her life, she didn't have any money at all, and the family obviously took care of her needs and expenses. So I kept a few dollars there in that drawer because when she would get a ride here for the 5 o'clock vigil mass, she would always say, "Give me some money so I can put it in the collection." So I would say to her, "Mom, don't worry, but you don't have to give anything." So she would be annoyed, and she would say to me, "Just give me $2 so people don't think the pastor's mother is cheap." So I happened to come across those dollars this past week, just before this story of the widow's mite. Another sign that our loved ones from heaven often communicate with us, and that people, like the widow in the gospel, have messages and challenges to deliver to us still and always. So God is always speaking to us in signs and symbols from the living and the dead, and I think our job is to pay attention, to listen, and to discern. And that's why we have these beautiful readings to think about all the time, but today. So I have a vivid memory from my childhood of our pastor using this particular gospel passage to encourage parishioners to increase the collection dollars and sternly reminding us that Jesus was watching what was placed in the collection basket. Maybe you had that same pastor too. But as an adult, I see something very different in this passage. In the Synoptic Gospels, this story comes just days before Jesus would empty himself on the cross. This is the last time that Jesus would be in the temple. So in this passage, it's interesting to note that Jesus is there, and he sat down opposite the treasury, and what was he doing? He was people watching in the temple. So what did he see? Well, he saw these people in long robes like this, walking around, hypocrisy, he saw arrogance, he saw a lack of charity. He had recently taught the Pharisees, as we heard a couple of weeks ago in the gospel, the second greatest commandment is that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And yet, only the poor widow seems to have heeded his words. Not all those people walking around. Her heart was open to Jesus' message, and she emptied herself by giving everything she had to give. The rich, who contributed to the temple from their surplus, weren't giving of themselves. They were merely offered a meager portion of their material goods, still clinging to so much more, to the rest. So Jesus could have been very discouraged that as his ministry was coming to an end, he had only converted this one poor widow. But God's love sees beyond such human calculation. God's love, like the widow's mite, pours itself out in love without counting the cost. And speaking of pouring oneself out in the presence of the American Legion today, it's interesting to note that, for almost 100 years, our country has set aside Veterans Day to honor, as President Woodrow Wilson said, the heroism of those who died in our country's service. These men and women emptied themselves in a service to a cause greater than themselves. Most of us aren't called to make such great, ultimate sacrifices. Yet we still struggle to make even little ones as we continue to cling to stuff, to our time, to our energy, to our desires, to our material things. The widow's mite and my mother's insistence on something to give is a challenge to me to consider what I cling to. God is always trying to get our attention. To what do we cling to today? And the question is, how can we let go of some of the stuff that separates us not only from God, but separates us from one another? When Jesus called attention to the temple widow, he didn't call her blessed, or he didn't say that others should follow her example. But he simply pointed out this. He simply pointed out that there's more than one scale on which to measure the value of what a person offers. There's more than one scale to measure the value of what a person can offer. I think some people often wonder about the things that they do in this life. Maybe like that widow in the temple. So a mother of 3 asked, "Am I really born to be a housewife and a mother? Shouldn't I be doing something more important? And yet, is there anything more important than the most important job in the world of being a mom, or the second most important job of being a dad?" Or a man asked, "Did I really come into this world to be a truck driver?" Well, if COVID did anything positive, it taught us to appreciate the great value of essential workers behind the scenes all the time, helping all of us to get through. Or a young woman wonders, "I work in an office. Was I meant to sit in front of a computer screen all my life?" Well, we can fill in the blanks, all of us in different ways, because what might to us seem ordinary, even on some days insignificant, might not be the way that Jesus sees our lives. He described the widow doing a simple act of love, and that was more important than anything anyone else was doing in that impressive temple with all those very important people around. So we could miss the holiness and significance of our daily offerings in the service to God and family and neighbor and country. Ironically, the temple widow isn't so much an image of discipleship as she is an image of Jesus himself, because like him, she received little positive attention from people who mattered, and like him, she was free enough to give her all, whether or not it would be appreciated. So Jesus may have drawn our attention to her, precisely to remind his disciples, and again us, that the reign of God operates on an alternative scale of values. An alternative scale of values, one that demands faith and solidarity together. In the long run, our pretensions, perhaps like the scribes and the Pharisees in the temple, in the long run, our pretensions make us far more fragile than our weaknesses and our poverty. When we accept our own neediness, like the widow, like my mother and her couple of dollars, we can discover the generous love that makes others' needs our own. And with that, we'll be part of creating that atmosphere of solidarity known as the reign of God. On this Marathon Sunday, we know that life isn't a sprint, but a long series of opportunities to run or to walk, or later on in life to be pushed perhaps, to give what we can to others. Maybe it's no coincidence that this gospel falls on the day that we had this extra hour to consider the time that we have to pay attention to the widows, to the signs that God and life, the living and the dead, give to us. And let me end by that interesting prayer at the beginning of the Mass that connects us to all of this. Almighty and merciful God, graciously keep from us all adversity, so that unhindered in mind and body alike, we may pursue in freedom of heart the things that are yours. Amen.